I work on a cruise ship and my boyfriend should have known I might not stay faithful. I don't get why he was so angry when I came back pregnant after a 6-month trip. He even talked about breaking up, but I want him to be the father of my child. Rodrigo looked at me from across the table at the hospital cafe and told me he couldn't sign anything as the father of a child whose blood he wasn't even sure was his. I had the insurance papers in front of me, the father's name space empty, and my son waiting for another test, while a doctor repeated that genetic information was important. I didn't have a single name to write there, other than that of a man I tried to force to be something he wasn't. For the first time, I felt that my whole famous cruise ship life was dwarfed by that blank sheet of paper. And that scene didn't come out of nowhere, it was built long before, ever since I decided that my rules were different. I always said that people who work on cruise ships live in a separate bubble. While my friends talked about crowded buses, split shifts, and demanding bosses, I told stories like sunrises on the high seas, crew parties at 3 in the morning, and new ports every week, as if it were normal to wake up in one country and go to bed in another. In that world, schedules are flexible, borders are blurry, and almost everyone is just passing through. When I met Rodrigo, what caught my attention was precisely that he wasn't fazed by all that. He had a steady job in the city, stable hours, Sunday lunches with his parents. He didn't seem dazzled by the pictures of the ship, but he still wanted to stay. At first, our dynamic had a romantic movie feel to it. Every time I boarded, he would take me to the airport at 4 in the morning, dead tired, but with that way of hugging me as if he wanted to record enough contact in his body for the months to come. I promised him I would write, that when the Wi-Fi worked, we'd have video calls, that I'd send him pictures of all the ports. For a while, it worked like that. I lived between two worlds, the sea and him, and I felt I could hold them both at the same time without them colliding. I'd come back from the ship with fresh stories. We'd spend a few intense weeks together, and then it was suitcases, airports, goodbyes again. Over the months, however, I started using a phrase that became my go-to for everything. You have to understand that my life is different. I'd drop it every time Rodrigo asked an uncomfortable question or seemed insecure about something. If days went by without me connecting, I'd tell him the Wi-Fi on board was a disaster. If he saw a picture of a crew party on social media and asked me who the people were, I'd reply that everyone on the ship was like a family. That it was normal for there to be people in the cabins at 3 in the morning, because the schedules have nothing to do with those on land. I'd finish by saying that if he was going to get jealous over every little thing, he wouldn't be able to handle this life. He'd lower his head a bit, apologize for being paranoid, and I'd feel validated. On the third long 6-month embarkation, the bubble became more intense. The ship was full, the theater shows doubled, the shifts got longer. That's when Lucho, the Argentine lighting technician, appeared, who always seemed to be everywhere at the same time. I don't know if that was his real name. On cruise ships, many people use nicknames and almost no one gives you their last name. He was one of those guys who could fix any problem on stage, who laughed at everything, who knew exactly what to say to make an exhausting night feel less heavy. We started with shared jokes in the tech booth, then with drinks on the aft deck after the shows, conversations where you end up saying more than you should. On a ship, the lines move fast. Between the fatigue, the confinement, and the fact that you know everyone is only there for a few months, things change tone without you realizing it. With Lucho, what started as flirting turned into travel sex, into that kind of unspoken agreement that many crew members have. Here, we're this. Over there, everyone goes back to their own life. There were nights when we ended up in the cabin laughing about anything, and I thought that was part of the package of working on cruise ships, that it was absurd to judge it by the same standards as a neighborhood relationship. I always had the idea in my head that my life on the ship was another reality, with its own rules. When I found out I was pregnant, there were only a few weeks left before disembarking. I knew from the nausea, from the missed period, from that strange feeling in my body that you don't mistake. I went to the ship's infirmary, they did a quick test, and the result was clear. I didn't sit down with a calendar to count days scientifically, but I knew that in those months Rodrigo and I hadn't seen each other in person, and that on the ship there hadn't been just one man. However, in my head, the line I drew was different. Rodrigo was the stable man waiting for me on land, the one with a serious job, a family, a future. Lucho was part of the cruise experience, a walking anecdote that stayed on the high seas. Instead of feeling like my world was collapsing, I clung to the idea that the universe was pushing me to form something. I told myself that in the end, what makes a father isn't genetics, but who stays, who is there. I imagined arriving in the city, telling Rodrigo I was pregnant, and seeing him get emotional. In my head, the rest, the part about who had provided the biological part, was a technical detail that could be resolved symbolically. I convinced myself that if he truly loved me, he would understand that my life is different, that the cruise thing was almost a geographical accident, and that the important thing was what we were going to build together on land. The day I disembarked, I returned with sunburnt skin, a suitcase full of clothes that smelled of ship's detergent, and that mix of tiredness and adrenaline that comes with finishing a long season. Rodrigo came to pick me up at the airport as always. He hugged me tightly, told me I looked thinner, more tired, that he had counted the days to see me. I already felt the nausea rising and falling and a new weight in my belly, but I kept it to myself until we were in his apartment, on that sofa where we had said goodbye and reconnected so many times. It was around 7 in the evening when I told him. I told him in a very measured voice that I was pregnant. I saw his eyes fill with tears, how his hand automatically went to my belly, how he smiled with a mix of surprise and joy. He hugged me. He kept repeating that he couldn't believe it, that it was what he had wanted most in his life. For a second, everything fit exactly as I had imagined, but then came the part that I considered a nuance, a small detail that was better to say at once so that it wouldn't be said that I was hiding things. I told him that I wasn't entirely sure the baby was his, that things had happened on the cruise, that I had always made it clear that that life was different and that it couldn't be compared to cheating here in the neighborhood. I talked about party nights, about colleagues who became almost family, about moments when it was very difficult to behave as if one lived in a glass case. I told him I didn't know exactly whose it was, that I didn't have a specific name beyond Lucho, that I wasn't even sure of his last name. And I finished with a sentence that is still hard for me to repeat. I told him that it didn't matter, that the important thing was for him to be the father, because he was the one who was staying, that biology doesn't make a dad. In my head, it sounded like a compliment, as if I were telling him he was the chosen one. Rodrigo's face fell in front of me. He moved away from the sofa as if the air had filled with smoke and started walking around the living room. With his hands on his head, he told me he felt cheated, that he had spent 6 months waiting for me, looking at my pictures of ports, presenting me to his family as the woman with whom he would one day start a family. While I was sleeping with who knows who in the middle of the sea, I defended myself by saying that he knew perfectly well where I worked, that anyone with half a brain understands that on a ship people experience things differently, that cheating in a city neighborhood was not the same as in a crew where everyone rotates. He looked at me with a mix of disgust and sadness that hurt me much more than if he had shouted. He said he couldn't be a father to something he didn't know if was his just because I had decided so on another continent. He repeated to me that the child wasn't the problem, that the problem was that I had made all the decisions alone over there, without asking him anything, and that now I was coming to ask him to swallow all that as if it were a test of love. He said he felt used, that it seemed I only wanted him to fill an empty space that someone else had created. I cried. I told him he was being selfish, that the child would need us, that real men don't care about genetics, but about who raises the child, that life was giving us a chance to build something bigger than any travel mistake. I reminded him of all the times he had promised to wait for me. I asked him if those promises only counted when things were perfect, without complications. From my point of view, he was throwing a family overboard for pride. From his, I had erased the foundation of trust on which everything rested. The following weeks were a kind of limbo. There were long silences, calls cut off in the middle, messages that were answered late. One day he told me he needed time to think, another that he couldn't look at my belly without remembering Lucho, a ship, a life he didn't share. I alternated between begging him to reconsider and getting angry because he didn't react as I expected. In my head, the logical thing was that with time the impact would wear off, and he would see beyond it, that he would focus on what was coming and not on how it had happened. In the end, the conversation that closed everything was short. He told me he couldn't, that he didn't see himself introducing a child as his own when every time someone asked who he looked like, he would have to swallow a story he didn't choose. He said he wished me the best with the pregnancy, that he hoped the baby would be born healthy, and that if I ever needed anything specific, we could talk, but that as a couple he saw no way to continue. He said it without yelling, with a calmness that was scarier than any scene. And there, without movie-like drama, it was over. I went on with the pregnancy. I told myself that in the end he had shown that he wasn't up to my special life, that he had fallen short of a different reality, that not all men can understand what it's like to be with someone who lives between ports and cruises. I convinced myself that the immaturity was his, that I was the one who was really facing up to things, the one who was taking responsibility, the one who wasn't hiding. In my version of things, he was the one who failed by not being able to rise to a complex situation. What I never admitted out loud was that at no point, while I was on deck with a drink in my hand and Lucho laughing by my side, did I stop to think about what life I was dragging someone into who was waiting for me on land with no idea that everything would change without him being asked. Comments. Anonymous User 1 says, "You spent months justifying everything with that phrase that your life was different and that on the ship the rules were different, as if that erased the reality that you had a stable relationship on land. Then you come back pregnant without knowing from whom and expect Rodrigo to take the hero's medal for accepting a package that you put together without his input. It's not immaturity that he doesn't want to, it's a minimum of self-respect." OP's response. From the outside, everything looks very easy and very orderly. No one was with me during those endless shifts. With zero support, putting up with clients, bosses, exhaustion, while on land everyone was warm in their bed. I never hid from Rodrigo where I worked or what that life was like. He decided to stay with me anyway. If he really wanted to be by my side, he also had to understand that things weren't going to be the same as in an office relationship. It's not that I was looking for a hero, I was looking for someone who was up to the reality I had chosen. Anonymous User 2 says, "You say that biology doesn't make a dad, but you skip the part that the decision to be a father is made between two people, not unilaterally. Because it's convenient for you for someone to put their name on it and act as an emotional cushion. Rodrigo wanted to be a father with you when he thought you were building something together. What he didn't accept was being the consolation prize after your cruise ship adventures. And that doesn't make him selfish, just someone who respects himself." OP's response. I wasn't looking for a consolation prize. I was trying to save something that already existed. We had a history, plans, a relationship that wasn't just anything. The fact that the circumstances got tangled doesn't erase all that. For me, if you love someone, you support them even when things get complicated, not just when the story is neat and perfect. The fact that he decided to jump ship at the first difficult port says more about his limits than my intentions. Anonymous User 3 says, "In the entire story, there's not a single mention of you stopping to think about how Rodrigo felt while you were playing at the ship being another reality. You only talk about your fatigue, your shifts, your need to feel free. When he tells you that the problem isn't the child, but that you decided for him, you have the clearest sentence in the whole story and you still dismiss it as drama. You don't want a partner, you want others to adapt to your decisions without question." OP's response. Of course I cared about how he felt. That's why I'd let him know, I'd tell him things, I tried to keep him in my life despite the distance, but I also couldn't expect my entire existence to revolve around him being calm on his sofa while I was in the middle of the sea. I made decisions in a context where nothing is simple and it's easy to judge them from the comfort of dry land. The fact that he couldn't handle that doesn't mean I was playing. It means we didn't agree on how to understand what it means to be with someone whose life doesn't fit the standard mold. Update 1. Gabriel was born on a rainy dawn in a public hospital that smelled of cheap disinfectant and reheated coffee. I arrived with poorly timed contractions, a half-packed suitcase, and a strange mix of fear and pride. Rodrigo wasn't there. He hadn't answered my messages for months, and I had already decided I wasn't going to beg for his presence, not even out of pity. While they were preparing me for delivery, I could hear in the next room how other women had the baby's father by their side, their mother-in-law, someone holding their hand. I had a hurried nurse and my mother, who came running when I called her. At that moment, I told myself it was better this way, that at least there was no one faking a role they didn't want. The labor was long, exhausting, one of those that seemed to never end. When I finally heard Gabriel's cry, everything was reduced to that sound. I saw him, and the first thing I thought was that he didn't clearly look like anyone, not me, not Rodrigo, not any specific face. He was a baby, with the wrinkled face of all newborns. I put him on my chest and, for a while, everything else faded away. There was no ship, no Lucho, no Rodrigo getting up from the sofa to flee a conversation. There was just this being attached to me who depended completely on what I did from then on. The less romantic part came later in the registration office. I sat in front of a sleepy-looking official who started filling out the birth form. "Mother's name," he said without looking at me much. I dictated it. Then came the question I knew was coming, but for which I wasn't really prepared. "Father's name." I felt an almost automatic impulse to say Rodrigo, as if saying the name would drag him back into our story, as if the paper could force him to assume what he had rejected in person. But I stopped myself, not only because I knew I couldn't legally make it up, but also because I had a kind of twisted pride that didn't allow me to write down someone who had decided to leave. The official looked up when I hesitated, as if waiting for me to say something. In the end, I said that there was no father to acknowledge at the moment and that the child would have my last names. He didn't even flinch. He crossed out a space, put a blank line, and continued. For him it was routine. For me it was like seeing a black hole materialized. I told myself it was temporary, that there were always options, that I could fix the papers later if the opportunity arose, either with Rodrigo, if he ever reconsidered, or with someone else who was willing to be a father from the heart. I left there with the certificate in my hand, Gabriel in my arms, and a strange feeling that I was missing a piece that I myself had pushed off the board. The first few months were a mix of extreme fatigue and survival. My mother helped me more than I like to admit. She would sometimes get up in the middle of the night. She taught me basic things I hadn't had time to learn between seasons on the cruise. I, however, couldn't get the idea of going back to the ship out of my head. It was my main source of income. The only thing that allowed me to see beyond the next month in terms of money. I started talking about it as something inevitable. When Gabriel is a little older, when he's stronger, I'll go back to the ship and he'll stay with my mother, who is always good with children. When that time came, I did exactly that. I went back to the cruise again, to that bubble of crazy schedules and changing ports, leaving him with my mother as if it were the most logical thing to do. I told myself I was doing it for him, so he wouldn't lack anything, so I could pay for his food, clothes, school. If it sometimes hurt to leave him crying at the door, I numbed it with the idea that later, when everything calmed down, I could rebuild something, maybe with Rodrigo if he matured, or with someone who knew how to see the value in raising a child, even if he didn't share their blood. I never stopped too long to look at that blank space on the certificate head-on. I preferred to think of it as an open door, not a hole. Comments on the update. 1. Anonymous user 1 says, you get to the registry, you hesitate for a second, and yet, your first reaction is to think about using Rodrigo's name to fill a void that you yourself created. Then you talk about pride as if that compensates for leaving your son without a legal father from minute one while you fantasized about fixing the papers later with any man who would accept the package. That hole isn't abstract. It's your son's identity. OP's response. At that moment I was alone, having just given birth, with 1,000 things on my plate and no one offering to really be there. Rodrigo had already made it clear he wanted nothing to do with it. I wasn't going to give the place on a piece of paper to someone who had left. I preferred to leave the space blank rather than force a signature. The fact that I thought about alternatives later is not strange. Any mother who doesn't have support is forced to find ways to give her child stability, even if they aren't ideal. Anonymous user 2 says, you talk about going back to the cruise as if it were the only possible option, but you frame it more from your need to maintain that lifestyle than from a real assessment of what it meant to leave a baby with your mother while you resume the bubble. You say you were doing it for him, but the whole story makes it clear that what mattered most to you is not giving up your sea routine, even if that meant continuing to postpone any definition about his father. OP's response. It's easy to talk about options when you're not counting coins to make it to the end of the month. The cruise was the job I had, the one I knew how to do, the one that gave me a decent salary. Giving that up out of pride or for appearances wasn't going to feed Gabriel. My mother was willing to help, and I clung to what I knew. It's not about a whim for the sea, it's about surviving with what you have on hand. Anonymous User 3 says, even in the delivery room you're still measuring everything in terms of who wants the role and who doesn't, but never in terms of what that void will mean for the child. You keep telling yourself that there will always be a way for someone to acknowledge him later, as if fatherhood were a position to be filled. You call it a father from the heart, but what it sounds like is a patch to avoid facing the fact that the only man with whom you could have established a clear paternity is already out of the picture. OP's response. It's not as simple as saying this was the one and that's it. Rodrigo made his decision. I couldn't force him to stay or to assume anything. Between leaving my son completely exposed and thinking that later I could find someone who wanted to be part of his life, I obviously preferred the latter. I don't see what's wrong with thinking about a father figure that is built over time, beyond blood. Update 2. When Gabriel was around 4 years old, he was still a small child, but things were already starting to seem not quite right. He tired more quickly than other kids his age. He bruised from minor bumps. He caught any cold that was going around. At first, I thought it was just that, a more delicate child, nothing serious. My mother said some children were like that vitamins would fix it, but the episodes started to repeat and more details were added. Fevers that took a long time to go down, infections that returned, blood tests that weren't quite right. I took him to his regular pediatrician, and after a couple of visits, he referred us to a specialist. That's where the atmosphere changed. We went from the colorful office with drawings on the wall to a colder room, with doctors who spoke in terms I didn't quite understand and who looked at the results as if they were assembling an incomplete puzzle. More specific blood tests began, meetings between doctors, long words about altered values and possible causes. I listened to everything with a feeling of floating, as if what they were saying didn't quite stick to my reality. In one of those consultations, the hematologist was very direct. He explained that to refine the diagnosis and foresee possible complications, they needed more specific genetic information. They needed to assess hereditary risks, family patterns, even the possibility of needing compatible donors in certain scenarios. He said it almost as if you were reading a checklist. Then he dropped the question that felt like a sharp blow. Do we have access to the biological father? Can we ask him for tests? Family history? I went blank. I stammered that no, that the father wasn't present. He insisted, without ill intent, but do you know who he is? Is there a name, a contact? And there, sitting in that uncomfortable chair, with Gabriel in the waiting room coloring dinosaurs without a clue, I had to say out loud something I hadn't even properly formulated in my head, that I wasn't sure. That on the cruise he had been a crewmate everyone called Lucho, but that I didn't know if that was his real name, that I didn't have his last name, or a number, or an email, that on ships life moves fast, people embark and disembark, and that identities get a bit blurry between one contract and another. The doctor looked at me with a contained mix of surprise and professionalism. He didn't make a scene, but his face changed. He told me calmly that without information from the father, they would have to go more blindly with some tests, that certain assessments would be more difficult, that some hypotheses would be left without a way to be confirmed or ruled out with the precision they would like. I nodded as if he were talking about anything, but inside I felt the phrase I had used for years crumble. It doesn't matter who the father is as long as someone raises him. There, with white coats and forms in front of me, it stopped being a pretty phrase and became a concrete void. I left that consultation with Gabriel holding my hand and a pile of papers in the other. He asked me if we could buy him a juice afterwards, as if the visit were just another pause in the day. I looked at his head, his back, his arms full of recent small punctures, and I couldn't stop thinking about a man on a ship's deck laughing with a drink in his hand, whom I had never asked almost anything that wasn't about that night. At that moment, For the first time, it didn't hurt that Rodrigo wasn't the father. It hurt not having anyone to even point to as a real possibility for the doctors. Comments on Update 2. Anonymous User 1 says, when the hematologist asks you about the father, and you have to say you don't even know his real name, last name, or anything, what collapses isn't just a pretty phrase, it's your whole idea that biology doesn't matter. Suddenly it matters a lot for specific medical decisions, and the one left without an answer is you, not Rodrigo. And yet, you still tell this as if it were a stroke of fate, not the direct consequence of your choice. OP's response. I never said that biology had no weight. I said it wasn't the only thing that defined a father. No one gets pregnant thinking their child will need detailed genetic information for complicated medical tests. When that happens, of course you realize all the things that are missing. But it's very easy to talk about choices when you're not in the middle of a system where people come and go and where there's no time or space to sit down and interview every person you cross paths with. Anonymous User 2 says, on ships, life moves fast. That's not a valid excuse when we're talking about knowing absolutely nothing about the man who provided half of your son's genetic makeup. You chose to get involved at that level with someone whose identity you knew by a nickname, while you had another person waiting for you on land. Now the doctors have to work blindly because of that carelessness, and the one paying the price isn't you, it's Gabriel. OP's response. In that environment, almost no one introduces themselves with their name, last name, family tree, and medical history. Relationships happen as they happen on crazy shifts with people from 1,000 countries. I'm not going to pretend that at that moment I had a perfect checklist. The fact that all of that now has consequences doesn't mean I acted with the intention of complicating my son's life. It means I made decisions in a context that few people really understand. Anonymous User 3 says, you were hurt not having anyone to point to when the doctor asked about the father, but you still don't mention the fact that there was a man who did want to take that place and you relegated him to a detail. Rodrigo isn't missing from the map by magic. He's gone because you decided that his role could be negotiated as it suited you. The void that opens up now is the result of having treated fatherhood as a flexible concept until reality asked you for concrete data. OP's response. Rodrigo isn't gone just because of my decision. When he had the chance to stay, he chose to leave. I didn't kick him out. He himself said he couldn't handle the situation. I'm not going to rewrite that part. The fact that information is now needed that he could have provided if things had been different is another story. But I can't live anchored to a permanent what if. I have enough just getting Gabriel through this with what we have. Update 3. The lack of data on the father went from being an abstract inconvenience to a concrete obstacle every time we entered a doctor's office. The doctors explained that without a clear family history, some tests lost their meaning or their results became more difficult to interpret. They talked about possible hereditary diseases, genetic patterns that could be traced if the history of both parents was known, the importance of knowing if there were cases of certain types of cancer or blood disorders in the family. These were conversations that in another life I would have heard as if they were other people's stories. Now they were recited to me with my son in the middle. Every new form they gave me to sign had a section dedicated to the father, name, age, medical history, contact. Sometimes they left the space blank and I returned it that way, with a line or a dash. On other occasions, the nurse would ask me directly if there was any data we could provide, even if minimal. I would repeat the same phrase, the father is not present, I have no contact. It was a kind of mantra that hurt me and slid off me at the same time. From saying it so much, it almost seemed that this absence was something that had come from the factory, not a chain of decisions that had started in a ship's cabin. At some point, the possibility arose that if Gabriel's condition evolved in a certain way, more invasive options would have to be considered, complex treatments, perhaps a transplant. It was then that a doctor, in a quick meeting in the hallway, mentioned bluntly that having the biological father available could be crucial, because genetic compatibility is usually better between parents and siblings. He said it as if he were commenting on another technical detail, but to me it sounded like a sentence. I nodded as if I were taking note of something that could be solved with a phone call, knowing that that man, whoever he was probably on another ship, on another continent, living another life with no idea that a boy named Gabriel existed. That stranger, whom I had always placed in the category of part of the cruise experience, suddenly became an indispensable and completely unattainable shadow. I found myself trying to remember, trying to reconstruct absurd details, some comment about his hometown, some detached photo frame in his cabin, some reference that would have allowed me to look for him. Nothing. They were jumbled flashes of work shifts, drinks, laughs, unmade beds. There was no last name, no social media, nothing to support a real attempt to track him down. And every lack of information translated into more uncertainty for the doctors. Meanwhile, Gabriel was still a child. A child with a hospital, yes, but also with drawings, games, and questions about why he had to go so many times to have his blood drawn. I tried to answer him with generic phrases so the doctors can see you're strong, to make sure everything is okay. I wasn't going to explain to him that his mother had decided that biology was a detail until medicine came asking for it with a name and last name. Every time I saw him turn his face for another prick, another sample, another test, I felt a mix of guilt and anger, but I didn't know where to direct it. It was easier to unleash it on the system, on life, on bad luck, than to admit that some of it came from long before. Comments on Update 3. Anonymous User 1 says, "Every empty form and every limited test are a concrete reminder that that other reality of the ship did have consequences on land. You say the father became an indispensable and unattainable shadow, but the unattainable appeared because you never bothered to make him anything more than a face on a shift night. Now that carelessness translates into blind medicine for your son, and you still talk about diffuse guilt as if it belongs to everyone and no one." OP's response. I'm not going to deny that it hurts to see those empty spaces, but I'm also not going to accept being blamed for the entire responsibility of a system in which people come and go without anyone bothering to fix anything. On ships, no one teaches you a manual on how to handle every relationship thinking about future medical scenarios. Of course it looks serious now, but at the time no one sits down to think about possible transplants or family histories when you barely have time to sleep. Anonymous User I says, "You stop to remember if you saw a photo frame in Lecho's cabin, but there's not a single mention of having asked him anything about himself at the time. You reduced him to seasonal entertainment, and now you expect that ghost to come and solve genetic compatibility problems. The reality is that there's no one to look for because you yourself decided he wasn't worth knowing beyond the moment." OP's response. In that dynamic, most connections are like that, intense, fast, and not very deep. It's not that I decided he wasn't worth knowing, it's that the context doesn't allow for an investigation into every person who crosses your path. In hindsight, it's very simple to say I should have asked for last names, contacts, and a family tree. At the time, the logic of the place doesn't lead you that way. Anonymous User 3 says, "You talk about the possibility of a transplant as if it were an external and cold scenario, but as soon as the doctor mentions that the father could be crucial, you take refuge in nodding and moving on, as if that shadow were a concept and not a person you never bothered to locate. It's hard, yes, but what's hard for Gabriel is that he doesn't even have the option of knocking on that door. Everything is decided over a void that you created with Every. It doesn't matter who the father is." OP's response. I'm not going to pretend that it doesn't weigh on me that he doesn't have that option, but I'm also not going to accept that it all boils down to one sentence. I did what I could with the information and circumstances I had. Now I have to deal with what there is, and that includes seeing how Gabriel faces things with the resources we have. I gain nothing by torturing myself with doors that, even if I wanted to, no longer exist to be opened. Update 4. In the midst of that mix of tests, incomplete formulas, and doctors talking about possibilities, I did something I had sworn I wouldn't do. I looked for Rodrigo. I found him on social media with the same face I remembered, maybe a little more serious. I saw pictures of him in the city with work colleagues, with his family. There were no children by his side, at least not in the public images. I stared at the screen for a long time before deciding to write to him. In the end, I sent him a very long message telling him about Gabriel, his age, the symptoms, the tests, the costs. I didn't ask for anything specific, but it was obvious I was looking for help. Days went by without a response. I checked my phone every so often, as if that would speed things up. When he finally replied, he didn't do it with reproaches or speeches. He told me he had read everything, that he was sorry, and that we could meet near the clinic to talk in person. We met at a coffee shop a few blocks from the hospital, as if we were repeating an old scene with a different script. He arrived on time, sat across from me, and I, unable to contain myself, started crying while I told him about the tests, about the technical words I didn't understand, about the sleepless nights thinking about results. I told him I was exhausted, that I couldn't handle it all alone, that Gabriel needed expensive treatments, tests that the insurance didn't cover. Rodrigo listened to me in silence, without interrupting. He asked me for specific details, doctors' names, tentative diagnoses. He didn't ask about Lucho or the pregnancy. He didn't throw any of that in my face. He just said he wasn't going to let a child suffer for money, that he could help with some studies. And he did. He made transfers, asked about the test results, showed up a couple of times in the waiting room with a bag of snacks and juices to make the wait less tedious. For me, it was inevitable to read those gestures as a half-open door. I started to imagine possibilities, that with time he could get closer to Gabriel, that they could build something even if it wasn't with his blood, that somehow that family I had given up for dead could be redrawn. So when the medical tension eased a bit, and we had a less chaotic afternoon at the hospital, I dared to suggest it. I told him that regardless of everything that had happened, Gabriel needed a stable father figure, and that no one understood our story better than him, that biology wasn't everything, that affection and presence also counted. That's where a limit appeared that I had never seen so clearly. Rodrigo took a deep breath and told me that at one time he had wanted to be a father with me when he thought we were building something together, with agreements, with a foundation. That he had been willing to do all of that before finding out that while he was waiting on land, I was deciding for both of us on a ship. He said that now, years later, he wasn't going to take on a role for which he was never really allowed to apply, and especially not just because things had gotten difficult. That he could help financially to a certain extent, because he couldn't bear the idea of a child suffering due to a lack of resources, but that he wasn't going to occupy a place that I myself had dynamited when I wanted to. He didn't say it with anger or by raising his voice. He said it with that tired calm of someone who has already cried all they had to cry and now is just protecting themselves. It was crystal clear to me that that limit wasn't going to move, not even with the medical drama in the middle. Rodrigo continued for a few more months, keeping up with how things were going, contributing what he could, showing up from time to time. Then, little by little, he began to distance himself. He didn't disappear suddenly. It was as if he were turning off lights one by one, leaving on only the one of minimal cordiality. And there I understood that there were things that no emergency, no matter how big, was going to resurrect. Comments on the update. 4. Anonymous user 1 says, "You went looking for Rodrigo again only when the situation became untenable for you. Not when Gabriel was born or when you registered him, nor when you went back to the cruise. And yet, the first thing you do as soon as you see he's still a decent person is to try to put him back in the role of the father he had already rejected, as if the child's illness erased everything that happened. His limit isn't cruelty, it's coherence." OP's response. I wasn't waiting for everything to collapse to write to him. I was respecting the decision he made to leave. When I saw that this was no longer just an emotional issue, but something that put a child's health at stake, it seemed logical to turn to the only person who had ever wanted to build something with me. The fact that he responded with help and not with reproaches says a lot. If I then tried to explore the possibility of him getting closer, it was because I saw there was human space, not because I wanted to erase everything with an excuse. Anonymous user I says, Rodrigo behaved like an adult. He helped financially, was present as much as he could, but he didn't allow you to use Gabriel's illness as a tool to rewrite the past. You keep talking about redrawing the family, as if it were a matter of closing your eyes and pretending that the pregnancy and the cruises were a misunderstanding. He simply refused to participate in that fantasy. OP's response. No one was treating the illness as a tool. It was the reality we had in front of us. Seeing that he was still a good person made me think that maybe there was still something to salvage. It's normal to cling to that when everything around you feels fragile. The fact that he decided to maintain a line doesn't mean I was playing. It means we didn't agree on how far something broken can be mended. Anonymous User 3 says, "You say you understood that there were things that no emergency was going to resurrect, but you still formulate it as if it were a kind of bad luck. The truth is that Rodrigo doesn't owe you the role of symbolic father just because you can't locate the biological one. He wanted to be that father at one point, and you excluded him with your decisions. Now, when he finally says, 'this far,' you interpret it almost as another abandonment, when in reality it's the only thing he's done that isn't marked by your rules." OP's response. It's easy to talk about not owing anything when you're not the one watching a child go in and out of hospitals. I know that legally and emotionally no one is obliged to take on more than they want, but that doesn't take away from the fact that seeing who Rodrigo is and how he behaves, one thinks there could be something more there. If he prefers to keep his border intact, that's his right. But that doesn't mean I don't have the right to feel that of all the adults involved, he was the only one who could have changed things a little. Update 5. I don't remember the following years as a clear line, but as a series of loose images. Waiting rooms with plastic chairs, Gabriel playing with a mask in his hand, envelopes with lab results, forms I filled out over and over again. In all of them, the father section remained blank or with a dash. Sometimes new doctors would ask about his history, as if it were the first time anyone had, and I would repeat the same answer, almost mechanically. With each new white-coated face asking for data, the same initial void reopened. Gabriel grew up in the midst of this panorama. He started to get older, to understand that not all children had to go to the hospital so many times or have so many tests. He also realized that something was missing from the papers. One day, while I was signing another authorization, he pointed his finger at the empty space and asked me who his dad was. He didn't do it with reproach. He did it with genuine curiosity. I just stared at him, not knowing where to start. I told him that things were a bit complicated, that his dad was someone I had met working far away, that we didn't have contact. I summarized in 3 sentences a whole mess that I couldn't even sort out myself without feeling my chest tighten. Over time, that question was repeated in different forms. Sometimes he wanted to know if his dad knew he existed, other times if he looked like him, other times if he would ever meet him. I took refuge in vague answers. I don't know. Life was complicated. Some people drift away. I never told him, I have no idea what the real name of the man who gave you half of what's in your blood is, because I didn't even know how to say that out loud. I stuck with the less harsh version, the one that allowed me to keep functioning without being paralyzed by guilt or absurdity. Meanwhile, Rodrigo gradually withdrew from the scene. For a while, he continued to help with some expenses and occasionally asked about Gabriel's results. Then the calls became less frequent, the messages more brief. There was no dramatic cutoff, just a growing distance. I interpreted it as another thorn in my side. I thought that in the end, not even a child's illness had been enough to keep him close. But if I was honest with myself, I also had to admit that he never promised more than what he saw after that coffee shop. He did what he said he could do and nothing more. I filled in the rest with expectations that no one had signed off on. Every time I saw a cruise ship in an advertisement, a magazine, an internet ad, I felt a strange pang. I remembered the nights when I defended my freedom by saying that Rodrigo had to assume there would be infidelities because it was part of the package, that my life was another reality and couldn't be measured by others' rules. Now that freedom translated into a son with no clear genetic history, full of incomplete forms and with questions I could only answer with I don't know what at the time seemed to me like living intensely. Now it looked different from a hospital chair. Gabriel, despite everything, was building his own character. He became more serious than I would have liked, more observant. He learned not to insist too much when he saw that my answers about his father became short. And I, who so often spoke of being different, of not fitting into the flat office life, ended up tied to a routine that had less glamour than any trip, medical appointments, paperwork, medication schedules. Every time he asked something I couldn't answer, I felt that I was the one shrinking, not him. But instead of dismantling my whole story, I took refuge in the familiar, repeating that I did what I could, that no one understands what it's like to live as I lived, that others also failed. Sitting in more than one waiting room, with Gabriel by my side looking at his phone, I would find myself thinking about Rodrigo. Not in a romantic way, but in the fact that of all the men who had passed through this story, he was the only one who had a real chance to become a clear father and chose not to accept an imposed role. And although I'll never say it out loud, there's something adult in that refusal that I lacked when I wanted to treat reality as if it had no consequences. I spoke of different lives and flexible rules, but when the consequences arrived, they didn't fall only on me. They fell on the only one who chose nothing, my son, who will have to live with me. I don't know as an answer every time he asks who the man is from whom he inherited half of what's in his blood. Comments on Update 5. Anonymous User 1 says, the hardest part of your story is that you're surprised that Gabriel becomes serious and stops insisting when he sees you're not going to give him answers. He learned to protect himself from the void that yourself created, and you continue to wrap everything in phrases like, life was complicated, instead of taking responsibility. Now, I don't know is not only a lack of medical data, it's the basis of his identity, and you treat it as an inevitable minor evil. OP's response. It's not that I see it as a minor evil, it's that at this point, as much as I'd like to, I have no way of changing those. I don't know, for something concrete I could invent, yes, but that would be worse. I prefer to be short with the truth than long with a lie. The fact that he learned not to insist also has to do with his personality. Not everything is a direct result of my decisions, no matter how much people from the outside want to see it that way. Anonymous User I says, it hurts you to see cruise ships in magazines because they remind you of the nights when you defended your freedom, but you still talk as if everything had been a chained fatality. The only person who showed a minimum of coherence was Rodrigo, who didn't accept a role decided without him. You, on the other hand, have been escaping responsibility for years, camouflaging it as I did what I could in a difficult context. That phrase might serve your conscience, but it doesn't fill out the forms or your son's questions. OP's response. I'm not going to deny that I did what I could. It's also a way of sustaining myself, because if I only focus on what went wrong, I don't move forward. The context was difficult. That's not an excuse, it's reality. Rodrigo made his decisions. I made mine, and Gabriel is in the middle of all of it. I'm still here supporting him in what's needed, and although I don't have all the answers, I'm not missing either. That also counts, even if it doesn't solve everything. Anonymous User 3 says, you say you'll never say out loud that the only adult was the one who refused to accept your script, but that silent acknowledgement is the closest you've come to seeing the situation clearly. The problem is that you stay there in internal reflection, without it translating into anything practical for Gabriel. He will continue to hear, I don't know, every time he asks, while you continue to protect your narrative that you were simply a different woman in a world that didn't understand you. OP's response. Not everything one thinks inside can be turned into speeches for others, especially for a son who already has enough to deal with. I deal with my conclusions as best I can, and at the same time I try to make his day-to-day life as stable as possible. That may not erase the past or fill the gaps, but at least it's something concrete that is in my hands now, unlike half of his story, which, whether anyone likes it or not, can no longer be recovered.